growth and relationships, or the importance of how to have a strong relationship with your child. Just as affirmation is really important in building up a strong relationship between a client and the therapist, affirmation is really important for a child to experience not only feeling wanted and feeling loved, but feeling that they can talk to you in a way that is supportive and caring. And the importance about affirmation, and something that I'm going to get into later this workshop, is that affirmation is something that is a universal need. It isn't just something that's just centered around supporting LGBTQ youth. It is something that every one of us growing up has benefited from, and we know when we're not getting affirmed. This kind of acceptance or just respect or appreciation of the kind of people that we are and our interests sometimes has experienced friction, and some folks will sometimes talk about some of their own decision making growing up that was not maybe accepted by their parents, or maybe sometimes their parents have said something that was very hurtful to them and might stick with them to this day. In ways that sometimes a question that I might ask a lot of adults is, in what ways do you find maybe, what do you remember maybe about growing up that you felt maybe wasn't affirming or wasn't supportive? It doesn't have to be about sexual orientation. It could be about hobbies. It could be about interests. It could be about loving a certain person. And affirmation also has a lot of connection to positive mental health. And without it, we do tend to see a lot of challenges for a lot of children growing up in terms of depression, anger, and anxiety. A common example for affirmation and supporting your child is actually exists a lot with boys. Often boys have a very limited range of ways they can express themselves emotionally because of maybe constraints in culture, or constraints in terms of what it means to be a man. So that for example, boys aren't allowed to cry, let's say. You have to man up. And the thing is, over time, that can be internalized. And while as they get older, if they're not having a space where they feel like it's okay to cry or it's okay to acknowledge hurt like that, it can come out often in other ways, one being anger. And the kind of pathway comes out because a lot of young men might grow into adults where they feel like maybe got very uncomfortable around the topic of feeling sensitive, of crying, of acknowledging weakness. And without the right kind of support, this also affects relationships. A lot of adult men experience higher rates of loneliness than women do, in part because a lot of men don't know might not often have the same kind of space to understand it's okay to be close with people. And sometimes a lot of those kind of emotional connections get dwindled down because of the way that a man is supposed to be, this kind of stoicness, or constantly a protector. And that's just something that, a lot of men, for example, navigate. And we see that as a common example. With something more specific for LGBTQ children, so there are some additional layers of challenges that children experience when it comes to maybe affirmations from a caregiver. So just some acknowledgements just before we come in. Part of this workshop is that I am expecting that sometimes parents might come in wanting support, but wanting to support their child, but not knowing how, or finding themselves a little out of scope, or feeling even inadequate or insecure that they may not have the best tools and resources to support their child. It's not a sign of bad parenting. If you don't entirely, quote unquote, get it, it doesn't mean you're a bad parent. What it just means is that this is an area that can be a space to nurture. It's okay to not always have all the information at hand immediately, but it is important to know how you have to navigate this going forward then. So same thing also with topics like pronouns. Over in 2020, through the pandemic, There's been a significant increase in a lot of a lot of teens identifying on the LGBTQ spectrum. And I'm going to use going forward just LGBTQ just in terms of just an umbrella term, just to cover everything from gay youth to transgender and gender fluid experiences. And many children are growing up feeling a little bit more comfortable using pronouns that sometimes maybe some parents might not be unsure of, might not understand entirely, or might bristle at. And an example being they, them in the singular pronoun. Doesn't mean just because you might struggle with that, that is a sign of bad, also bad parenting, but it is also an acknowledgement that often with pronouns, it means validation. So if you're using the right kind of pronoun, children do understand, like do appreciate that, because it does actually fortify some of their self-esteem. If they're being invalidated, maybe constantly being misgendered, such as using the wrong pronoun, that does have an impact in terms of who they feel comfortable with. And it also has an impact on the way that they relate, connect with their parents, connect with also how they see themselves. And misgendering isn't just a queer experience. Like many kids do get misgendered on purpose with an intent to harm. So using the boys example, how many times that maybe in your own experiences have you grown up where you've heard boys being compared to like being called girls, or being feminized in a way that was meant to be insulting? Same thing for women, where being compared to being a man was used as an insult. While it's not as clear in terms of being misgendered, the way that these type of topics come up and use as an insult does leave an impact, and it can really tap into some people's feelings about themselves and their self-image and their self-esteem. So we do know what harm looks like when somebody does get misgendered. It's also unsure, as I was saying before, it's also okay to not be sure of the best avenues of support. That's what part of this workshop is for, to really give opportunities to talk about this honestly, and in a non-judgmental way. And the last one is that we also know and are mindful that sexual orientation and gender identity sometimes have friction points when it comes to culture, when it comes to religion, when it comes to other values. And part of this conversation is not really to address all the reconciliation between all that. Instead, it's just more of a conversation of identifying spaces to explore that while also supporting your child. And those spaces can be separate. Often they need to be separate in order to best approach some of the ways you want to affirm your child. So affirmation on its own is a positive statement or a series of statements about a person that supports their what's called their intrinsic goodness or worth. Intrinsic goodness is just their value as a person. Affirmation is found through emotional support, through validation, through nurturing, even respect. And sometimes in therapy, we'll have conversations between parents and children where the conversation of respect comes up in a mutual way. How do their teens respect their parents, and how do parents respect their teens? And it's a different kind of conversation than I think sometimes a lot of adults might be used to, where it's acknowledging that often teens are their own person. And it does mean that they have their own ideas of things, they have their own sense of what's important for them, their own emotional needs, their own mental health needs. And sometimes that doesn't always align with what maybe their parents feel is best for them. Often, in particular, when it comes to supporting LGBTQ youth, the main anxiety for many parents isn't rejection or like rejecting their child. It's often more concerned about their safety. You know, in their own home, maybe their child is allowed to be who they are, but what happens when they're out on the street and they're kind of vulnerable to just anybody that might come up to them might hurt their child. And those anxieties are understandable, and they're coming from a place of concern. But with affirmation, being mindful of some of these other challenges that come up, affirmation does nurture self-esteem, confidence, and self-worth. David D. Burns, who's this psychologist, he wrote a very well-known self-help book. It's called Feeling Good. He had this idea that's called the 1 unit of worth. And a 1 unit of worth is basically this understanding that everybody has a single unit of worth. Nobody is worth more than the other person. And that by building in this kind of perspective, and there's a lot of different steps to this understanding of this, but it's kind of this conversation of saying that you don't only have a unit of worth, but that you are worthwhile, which is a conversation that a lot of people don't often have about themselves, or even sometimes about a parent to a child. This idea that you're worth knowing, you're worth having a feeling love, you're worth experiencing good things in life. All that comes with affirmation. And many LGBTQ youth will often share in therapy that they don't usually hear that, or they don't find themselves feeling that they are loved or that they do have respect from others. And in doing so, they don't feel like they're capable of maybe finding love themselves or loving themselves in general. So for a lot of common stressors among teens, and these are some experiences or some things that might get said in therapy space, much of it comes from these ideas of feeling very anxious about their place in the world, and about more so often than just their entire internal understanding of their identity and sexual orientation. These stressors are sometimes called environmental stressors, meaning that it's just more of how a child navigates the world. And much of the friction that LGBTQ teens face comes from how they navigate their communities, what they feel are supportive spaces, what they feel are not as supportive spaces, or spaces of harm, spaces of violence. And some of these conversations or some of these quotes are things that I've heard in therapy. These are things that I run often support groups outside of Wagner High School. And these are things that will come up from a place of feeling that if they were to be out to their parents, their biggest concern is that they're going to get kicked out of the house. And many LGBTQ youth are at risk of homelessness. There you go. So when we're talking about these kind of stressors, something that I've highlighted in the past in prior trainings is this idea of a stress spectrum. And when I'm talking about these environmental stressors, these aren't as easily solvable as some other types of stresses like a test. Like healthy stress is often things that have a little bit more management to it, a little bit more predictability, and often have a bit of a time duration to it that's very clear. Like if a child's stressed about a test, they take the test and they typically feel a lot better afterwards. When they're constantly ruminating on the idea that if their parents ever found out that they were gay, that's no longer a conversation about management. That's a conversation about anxiety. And there's no often clear solutions for that. They might not know what their parents might feel if they found out. And when that gets ruminates, that emerges over and over as an anxious thought, that does often shape a lot of the ways that they handle other stresses, the way they handle relationships, and it also impacts their mental health, often in a negative way. Typically, when stress gets more extreme, like the idea of maybe a looming threat that if they were outed in some way, they might be exposed to some kind of violence. Often that has a detriment to a child's development. Stress for a child is a lot different. Experiencing stress for a child is a lot different than experiencing stress as an adult, because children's brains are still developing, and intense toxic stress often has a serious impact on the way that a brain develops. And part of these experiences is often that LGBTQ youth are at greater risks for depression and anxiety, self-harm and suicide, negative self-esteem, self-image and self-worth, and homelessness and violence. There's a large standing shelter system for LGBTQ youth. It's called the Ali Fournet Center. We have one in the city. And, one of the biggest things that they often see is that for a lot of homeless youth that come in, a big critical aspect about their experiences and their impact on their health is that they don't have a support system. And without that support system to give them some peace and to try and approach their life challenges in a productive way, they often find a lot of the ways that they take care of themselves to be breaking down. It's harder and harder to really feel like what you need, what support you kind of need, when you're constantly having to protect yourself and take care of yourself in very extreme conditions. So when we're talking about these kind of issues, especially chronic harm, chronic stresses, what we're talking about is an idea called systemic harm, which is the idea that often harm doesn't entirely just exist between maybe a non-supporting parent, or maybe the possibility of violence outside in the community. It often is something that's inundated or sometimes normalized in a society. And some of these images are meant to really highlight some of the changes that a lot of LGBTQ people have faced in terms of acceptance, in terms of expressing themselves in an affirmative way, and feeling comfortable being who they are in open spaces. You know, there's not, sometimes it might be a misunderstanding to feel that just there's just a lot more LGBTQ teens now because it's just a phase and it's just popular. What it really is actually more of is that for a large part of US history, there's been policies and practices of targeting largely LGBTQ people, either through their jobs, such as firing somebody, or through outright violence. And when that is something that's regurgitated over and over and over again as an experience, many LGBT people had to find very specific spaces to feel comfortable and be who they are. As these things are getting broken down, a lot more LGBTQ youth are experiencing a lot more support and affirmation to feel comfortable navigating these things. And part of these type of conversations is really important because many teens now, I believe I'm not entirely sure what the statistic was. I believe it's like 1 in 6 teens identify on the LGBTQ spectrum, which is huge compared to my generation. I'm 1990, and to see the huge difference in terms of the culture over these past 30 years is significant in terms of kids navigating things a lot more openly. So when we talk about our affirmation, there are these significant evidence that shows that when you create an affirming space, by giving them that positive regard, teens do notice that. In the same way as an example, I'll use an example of in a general sense, sometimes some clients coming in where they'll talk about a time their parents were affirming them in a way that they were often very nervous about, and they remember those moments. Or they'll remember often a teacher that gave them validation and respect in a way that maybe no one else did. These experiences, these affirming people really stay with a lot of LGBTQ folks, in part because it really does leave a lasting impact on helping their mental health and wellness. Just having one affirming space, one affirming person that validates and speaks to their teen with respect and dignity, it does have a significant impact on reducing the risk of suicide and self-harm. These are just some statistics just to demonstrate just around suicide, reducing suicide attempts, but many youth do benefit from this affirmation because it will alleviate a significant part of their anxiety and their depression symptoms. It won't alleviate everything, but they'll have a lot more ground to stand on and a lot more comfort in terms of solving some of their other challenges in life when they know that there are people rooting for them. Laura, you had a question?
What was the name of that author of that book that you mentioned? That sounded really good.
Oh,
Affirmation.
It's David. Yeah. So there's affirmations came from the psychologist. His name is Carl Rogers. He has this book. I think it's called Becoming an Authentic Person. He's like a psychologist from the 60s. He kind of laid the foundation for a lot of like modern therapy. Really good like writer too. And then the other one, the one for about like unit of worth, and kind of built on this idea of self-esteem. His name is David D. Burns, and he wrote a book. It's Feeling Good. So when we're talking about this, yeah.
Thank you.
So when we're centering the conversation for parents, part of the work sometimes in therapy is that we give space to children often to really kind of explore these conversations in a way that they can actually have an opportunity to feel not only not be judged, but also do so in a confidential way. We also are mindful that parents do need their own spaces, and in terms of maybe addressing maybe some of their own concerns that they're having. So in terms of centering the conversation around parents, one question is just what is the energy that you might be sitting with if you find out your child might be identifying on the LGBTQ spectrum. What energy does that sit with? What emotions are you able to identify and label? And it might be one thing, it might be a ton of things. You might be relieved, but also confused. Is another question is the sense of centering it around how you respond. Is the way you're talking to your child about their identity. Is it helping or does it harm their mental health? So this is where it might be a conversation, and let's say going back to like pronouns, where I've had sometimes some folks who are otherwise really great parents sometimes say that, yeah, my child, she's using they now. All these kids are using they these days. I just don't get it. And then they might be saying that in front of their kid. And their children are listening, and it's something that's important to be mindful of, is that you might have your own maybe questions about this, but is the way you're talking about these issues, especially in front of them, doing any potential harm in just the relationship between the two of you. Sometimes some parents might question, like, I just don't know why my child doesn't talk to me anymore. And a frank conversation that comes up in therapy is, what are the conversations, like, what do you talk to your child about? Does anything that you might be saying, especially around like LGBTQ matters, is it invalidating, or is it just curious, or is it potentially egregious and like potentially harmful? Same thing also in terms of these type of conversations, is that it just because something might have been said that's hurtful doesn't mean that it has to constantly look like that either. Sometimes for parents, as with us, with our own parents, parents are complex people, and it does, they're not just one thing, and they're not just one label. Parents do have a lot of experiences where they are really great, and then sometimes for some adults, they might have felt that maybe they wish their parents stepped up a different way, maybe to a life problem. The same thing also comes up with these kind of conversations. Just because maybe you don't entirely understand it right now, it doesn't mean that it always has to look like that. It doesn't mean that you can't improve the relationship. It just means that as you're kind of exploring this, the centering conversation is trying to figure out, all right, I feel like there might be a wedge between my child and me. What do I need to figure out maybe on my end to create better avenues of inroads to build a stronger relationship? And that's often a big part of my focus in therapy with families, is that I'm mindful that people are coming in with very different experiences and ideas about things. But, a big conversation is really, do you want a relationship with each other? And most families do. And part of that conversation is being able to say, all right, what can we do to strengthen the relationships between everyone today? And part of the work. It's also not okay to have these expertise in here, but part of these got all mixed up. It's okay not to know everything, but a question might be, what resources do you need to look into to strengthen the relationship? What do I need to do as internal research? Do I want my child to be the ambassador to everything LGBT, or do I need to maybe do some of the work on my I'll tell you just as offhand, a lot of queer teens do hate being the ambassador and telling parents everything about the queer community because it can sometimes get exhausting. And so just a word of just awareness about that. Um, what thoughts and feelings am I sitting with when my child uses pronouns and name different from the one I've always known them as? Is a very real conversation. It's one that often we encourage to try and keep separate from sometimes some of the conversations directly with the child. Because you're for some parents, they might be processing some of these experiences and processing some internal struggles. But sometimes when they're doing so, the child is often very aware of maybe their struggles or even grief about quote unquote about the idea of not knowing your child as who they used to be growing up. And that can sometimes contribute to some anxiety or some harm to maybe their self-esteem as they might try to relate with you. It may not make them maybe feel uncomfortable about maybe sharing more things sometimes with a parent because they are not sure that if they're already struggling with this thing, they may not be entirely sure if they're going to struggle with maybe some other things they may talk about. So while we're mindful of sometimes these kind of conversations that do come up, and they're very real conversations, the importance of finding a space separately of your own to really kind of answer this is important. That's sometimes what therapy is also for. You know, it's confidential and it's non-judgmental. And these are conversations that happen. They're the conversations that I get, asked a ton of times. And part of the work in therapy is to explore it, in a way that's not going to shame a parent, but also to be mindful that you're figuring this out and you also have to support your child. And sometimes it can be an eternal struggle. All right, hold on.
Hey, Nick, can I ask a
Yes.
quick question?
Yes.
Is there an average age where a child or a person knows? Like, do we have a number? Like 6, 7?
So yeah, actually,
Mm.
so I'll share this and it's a good question. A part of often actually these conversations about orientation and gender identity, sometimes you'll start seeing more of a conversation about it as children start to verbalize. But much of this does form very early on at an early age. Children do start to conceptualize ideas about gender and sexual orientation early on. And the thing also just to be mindful of is that, for conversations around sexual orientation, that kind of is a conversation that's more about something called a need, where it has more to do with genetics than it really has to do with anything else, and which I'm going to get into in a second. And gender identity, when folks call it a social construct, what they're really saying is that gender is learned and that gender is something that people learn through the observations of others, through socializing, through culture. And gender also is not consistent in each culture. There's you may want to, if any of you are curious about this, like there's actually a group of Albanian assigned female at birth, meaning that they were born as women, who due to what's called these like legacy killings, which were basically these honor killings that wiped out a large portion of the male population in Albania. A lot of women took on roles as the men in on the farm and assigned themselves male roles, and they lived their lives as men. They look like men, and they aspire. They have roles as patriarchal figures in their families. And that is something that's part of a cultural practice in Albania. Another actually example, and I'm gonna actually say this for a lot of anybody who's Italian here, there's actually documentation in Naples when Italy was more city-states prior to unification, of documentation of something called of transgender people. Largely identified as or sometimes described as feminine gay men, but they were trans people. And the term is il femminile. And, gender is something that's come up a lot. It's not just this binary, it's has a lot of fluidity to it actually, and it changes depending on the culture, and it's shaped by culture. Often a lot of stressors that children experience growing up around gender identity has less sometimes to do with something innate and more about a friction of what they feel comfortable with versus sometimes the friction of a culture that, or community rather, that might do harm to them. So it's kind of like these kind of, that's like where it becomes like conversations about safety and stress, the conversation of being outed because you might like feminine things or you might identify more with like feminine clothing if you're a male. So when we talk about these kind of conversations, that's really where people sometimes find some of the greatest challenges is like this idea of like, what is gender? And sometimes it's kind of not the most, sometimes the answer is not always satisfying because it's not really concrete. It's something that actually develops and is learned. The other part also just about this as part of information is that we're also mindful that these things do sometimes come up. And part of the last one over here is that part of the conversation is these types of challenging, these friction points around growing up, what you felt like was maybe something you felt was appropriate for you versus what might be appropriate for your child or what you feel like your child's doing. And this isn't something that's just unique to LGBTQ teens. The matter of clothing in particular has always been a topic of discussion around what are assigned clothing, what is the stereotypical clothing. For example, for women, when they started wearing pants, in early US history, that was met with a lot of anger because women were breaking traditional norms and promoting sometimes what they call lesbianism, which is this idea that basically like pants made you no longer straight. And there was hysteria about that, and same kind of hysteria about sometimes men wearing feminine clothing. And I'm saying that directly because this is always, this stuff sometimes is new for folks now, but it's never been new in terms of history. And these conversations have always changed and have always kind of been modified. And one more, just to kind of go off of it too, is just like even things that seem normalized for us now, like colors blue for boys, pink for girls, wasn't always the case. In the 1800s, it was pink for girls because pink was associated with Venus and was more feminine. Blue. Because blue was associated was dainty and it was associated with Venus, and pink was more red and associated with God of Mars. So this stuff has changed. It's never been consistent.
I think you should blame Anna Wintour for the most recent. That's a whole other conversation.
But yeah, so just being mindful of the tangent and just part of this conversation. It's just always been something that's just why we sometimes emphasize this conversation about do research, like explore it. It's sometimes, yeah, it's uncomfortable. Perhaps, or maybe you might be sitting some kind of energy, but explore it, see where that's coming from, and get build a deeper understanding about some of these topics because it is really interesting. And it isn't also just like a phase, which brings me to just kind of centering and supporting your child. It isn't a phase. As I was saying before, a lot of these things have more to do, sexual orientation in particular has more to do with gender, with something innate. And it's also not a mental illness. In the history for the DSM, which is like the diagnostic manual that a lot of mental health professionals use, there was a period of time where in the 70s in particular, where homosexuality, quote unquote, was recognized as a mental illness. But even then, that wasn't universally accepted. And there was a lot of internal fighting within the organization that created the DSM about removing it from the 70s because they felt that it really didn't make any sense in the manual as a mental illness. Same thing also with sometimes the term gender dysphoria, which is this idea that, which is this understanding that people experience distress when their bodies don't match maybe the person that they are. And there's been pushback even about that as whether or not that should be in the DSM. So these are not, these are conversations that have been ongoing and are constantly developing, but something that a lot of medical organizations will say, something a lot of mental health organizations will say, is that it's not something that requires treatment. Often the concern is more about the stresses they experience around their mental health because they don't have the affirmation, because they don't have the support, because there's always a looming threat of potential violence if they're navigating who they are in the world. The other part is also no one's to blame. This sometimes, I don't see it as often, but something that that has often come up is this idea, let's say for gay teens, this idea for gay male teens, this idea that they're gay because their moms were coddling them too much, or we're teaching them to be too sensitive. And that's not real at all. That's not based in any evidence. That's just part of something that one always it seems to be centered around blaming parents, particularly the mom, for everything. But also is centered around these ideas of, like, let's say an absentee father, that dad's not around, so that's why you're gay, or you were gay because of sexual abuse. Those things do not have a connection to sexual orientation and gender identity. Instead, it's just more of they are because they are. And there's also no indoctrination. This used to come up, and it's kind of been rearing its ugly head lately. Indoctrination being that children are kind of being inundated with this idea of, like, you have to be gay, or that there's gay people in schools in particular would make children gay. And it's part of more of a moral panic that actually had a connection in the 90s. A lot of LGBT teachers who taught in the 90s experienced a lot of harassment because of this idea that they were threats to children, that their mere presence would try to convert children secretly. And it led to not only harassment of these LGBTQ teachers, but some people have experienced direct violence as a result of it. And unfortunately, especially with the internet, this has definitely come up again as a conversation. But there is no such thing as indoctrination. It's just more of kids, like, sometimes it's also like this idea that, like, well, there's more queer kids because of indoctrination. It's like, no, there's more queer identifying children because there's more affirming spaces, because people do have more resources. So people feel much more comfortable coming out now because a lot of other things have been broken down as harm. So in terms of real practical resources school-wise, these are some resources to consider in terms of navigating things. And I'm just being mindful of time, so I just want to wrap up after this slide. Know who your resources are at the school in terms of support, LGBTQ identifying supported systems, like Gay Straight Alliance, for example. There's also the idea of taking a team approach. So, for example, my office is open for any coaching or consultation for parents and other caregivers if they're questioning or trying to figure out what is the best avenue of support for their child. Another one is also trying to see, like, what do you feel like your child needs to hear from you as you navigate these topics? You might be feeling one way, but your child might be looking at you for maybe solid answers about, do you still love them? If you knew that they were LGBT identifying on the LGBTQ spectrum. And the last one is also a safety plan. So this is about ideas about coming out, for example, about if people knew if people knew your sexual orientation or gender identity, are they safe people? Who's maybe not entirely safe to be around? Who would not be safe if they found out that maybe you were gay? What would that look like? Sometimes with teens, sometimes more on your own. Having an informed plan of just saying, like, these are the things I need to be mindful of, can also be really helpful in terms of identifying any bullying that a child might be experiencing, and having options and resources to know what to do about that, if they might be bullied because they're trans, for example. And last is just some resources centered especially on Staten Island. So the Trevor Project is the national crisis hotline for LGBTQ youth age 13 to 24. They have a phone line that's confidential, available 24/7. They also have text and chat services for youth. You don't have to call if a child does not have to call if they feel suicidal. They can call if they just need to talk to somebody. And the Trevor Project staff are trained. They're very good at their job. Another one is PFLAG. PFLAG is a support group for parents specifically to help navigate things if they found that they're like maybe their child came out to them, for example. And they have a chapter on Staten Island. It's at the Pride Center. And the resource here also for the Pride Center is they recently moved. They have a new location now. They're no longer closer to the ferry. They're a little bit further down from the ferry, but they have a much bigger office. They are actually having Staten Island Pride coming up, which they organize. So if you go on their website, you can find out also a little bit more about what they're doing. And if you ever wanted to like, just check it out. And last is a Family Acceptance Project. This is actually an information center, information hub for a lot of parents to do some research on their own. They have research articles that are peer-reviewed, meaning that they've been shared by other researchers. It's been really useful in terms of helping parents kind of navigate a lot of challenges like this, as well as also tips and ideas of how to support their child, as you navigate some of these conversations. And with that said, thank you so much. And I again apologize for the hiccup earlier today. But does anyone have any questions? And again, I want to use this as an affirming, like a supportive space. So there's no judgment. I mean, if even at